Welcome to the place where fear finds you. So sit back, put on your headphones, and remember some stories don't end when the video does.
Have you ever heard stories about cabins deep in the woods? You know, the kind of stories that make you hesitate before agreeing to a weekend trip. Well, our first story comes from a guy named Jake. He and a few friends had been planning this trip for months. It wasn't just any cabin. They had heard about it from an old local map and a few hushed warnings online. The cabin was supposedly abandoned, sitting deep in the forest where no one really went. Most people in town avoided it. Some said it was cursed, some said it was just creepy, but Jake and his friends thought it sounded exciting. A weekend of escaping city life, telling stories around a fire, and maybe even catching a glimpse of wildlife. It seemed perfect. When they first arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, painting the trees in a dull, orange glow. The cabin itself was exactly what they expected. Old weather-beaten wood, shingles missing from the roof, and windows so dusty that you could barely see inside. The gate creaked on its hinges as they pushed it open, and the long, narrow path leading to the cabin was overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. The forest was quiet, too quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, but in a way that made you feel like you weren't entirely alone. They spent the first hour exploring the cabin. The inside smelled like old wood and dampness. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the furniture looked as though it had been abandoned for years. They joked about ghost stories and creaking floors as they settled in. Jake's friend Mark found an old deck of cards in a drawer and suggested they play. So they gathered around the small rickety table in the living room. Laughter filled the room, but behind the jokes, a strange tension lingered, like the cabin was listening. Around 11 p.m., as they were finishing a game, Jake felt a gaze on him, heavy and deliberate. He turned sharply toward the window and froze. There was nothing there, just the black expanse of the forest and shadows of branches moving in the wind. "It's probably just the trees," he muttered to himself, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. But it didn't help. The feeling stayed, prickling at the back of his neck like icy fingers. A few minutes later, a soft knock echoed from the back door. One knock, then another, slightly louder, and then a rapid tapping, almost frantic. Jake's heart jumped. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The others shrugged. Mark laughed. "It's probably just some animal," he said. But even as he spoke, his voice had a nervous edge. They all got up to check the back door. As they approached, the knocking stopped. Jake reached out for the handle, and just as he touched it, the door slowly creaked open by itself. A cold gust of wind slammed into their faces, making them stumble backward. Their laughter died in their throats. "Okay, maybe that's not an animal," Jake said quietly. They all stared at the open door, unsure whether to step outside or run back to the living room. They went back to the table, trying to brush it off, but that's when they noticed the wet footprints on the wooden floor. Fresh, dark, muddy prints that led from the back door toward the living room. But there was something impossible about them. They stopped abruptly near the fireplace. No footprints led back to the door. No footprints led anywhere else. Just there, for the rest of the night. They couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, every distant howl of an animal or something made them jump. The knocking returned, sometimes from the roof, sometimes from the floor beneath them. They tried to convince themselves it was the wind, that it was just an old cabin, settling. But deep down, they knew something wasn't right. Around 2 a.m., Jake got up to check on the back door again. The moonlight filtering through the broken windows cast long shadows across the floor. He squinted toward the door, expecting to see nothing, and that's when he saw it. A shadow, standing just beyond the doorframe. Tall, dark, featureless. And it wasn't moving, but somehow, it felt like it was watching him. Jake froze. His friends were asleep, or at least pretending to be asleep. He debated screaming, calling out, running. But before he could move, the shadow disappeared. Just gone. Morning finally came, and the group decided to inspect the cabin and the surrounding area. They expected footprints, maybe some clue about what had been there. But the snow or dirt, depending on the season outside, was completely untouched. No prints, no signs of entry or exit, nothing. They couldn't explain it. The strangest thing, though, was the footage from the security camera Jake had set up outside as a precaution. They hadn't checked it the night before, they were too scared, but in the morning, they reviewed it together. The video showed the shadowy figure standing at the window, watching them for nearly 10 minutes. Its form was dark, humanoid, but the camera couldn't capture a face, just the outline. When they ran outside to confront it, nothing. No figure, no footprints, no sign it had ever been there. They left the cabin that morning, the quiet forest suddenly feeling oppressive and heavy. Jake kept glancing in the rearview mirror as they drove away, half expecting to see a dark figure following them down the narrow road. They never went back, and none of them have ever returned to that forest. Years later, Jake still thinks about that night. He can't explain it. He doesn't try anymore. But sometimes, when he's alone, he swears he can hear soft knocking from somewhere just outside, persistent, deliberate, like someone is still watching. And every now and then, in his dreams, he's back in that old cabin, staring at the back door, wondering if whatever was there is still waiting. The second story comes from Mia. She and her boyfriend, Daniel, had been looking forward to a quiet weekend in the forest for weeks. They wanted to escape the constant noise of the city, the endless traffic, and the pressure of work. They found a small cabin tucked away in a secluded corner of the woods, far from the nearest town. It was rustic, but cozy, with a fireplace in the living room and a small porch that overlooked the dense forest. When they arrived, everything felt peaceful, almost magical. The sun was low, filtering through the trees and casting golden rays across the cabin's wooden exterior. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and for a moment, Mia felt like they were the only two people left in the world. That first night was perfect. They lit the fireplace, brewed hot coffee, and spent hours sitting close together, talking quietly and laughing at little things. The cabin creaked now and then, but it only added to the charm, or so they thought. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife, the soft rustle of leaves, and the occasional distant call of an owl. It was comforting, in a strange way, and they both fell asleep that night feeling completely safe. But on the second night, things started to feel different. Mia had gone to the bathroom to wash her face before bed. As she stood in front of the mirror, she got that unmistakable feeling that someone was watching her. She froze, eyes darting toward the small window beside the sink. At first, she told herself it was impossible. They were alone. No one could be there. The forest was quiet, the cabin remote. It had to be her imagination, or maybe the shadows playing tricks in the dim light. But the feeling didn't go away. Every time she blinked, she felt it stronger, like eyes were boring into her from the other side of the glass, trying to calm herself. Mia quickly finished in the bathroom and stepped out. That's when she noticed something that made her heart almost stop. The closet door, which she was certain they had closed tightly, had slowly creaked open. She stared at it, her hand hovering near the doorframe as though she might need to push it closed again. She called out to Daniel, who was sitting on the couch, reading. "Daniel, the closet. It's open," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel looked up and chuckled, brushing it off. "It's just the wind. Old cabins do that, you know. Don't overthink it." Mia wanted to believe him. She really did. But a small part of her didn't want to admit what she was starting to feel, that they were not as alone as they thought. She shrugged, forcing a laugh, and tried to shake off the unease as she returned to sit beside him. Hours later, the first unsettling event happened. They were both in bed when they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the floor above them. The cabin only had one story, but Mia could clearly hear the sound, echoing from the ceiling. At first, she thought maybe it was the wind again, or an animal on the roof, but the steps were too regular, too purposeful, and then they stopped directly above their heads. Mia froze under the covers, barely daring to breathe. Daniel's face turned pale, and for the first time that night, he seemed genuinely scared. "It's probably just the cabin settling," he whispered, though his voice trembled. "Yeah." "Settling," Mia muttered back, though she didn't believe it for a second. Then it happened. A long, heavy breath, slow and deliberate, echoed from the ceiling. It sounded human, yet distorted, almost unnatural. It wasn't coming from a vent. It wasn't an animal. It was coming from inside the cabin, above their heads. Mia could feel her heart hammering, every beat thundering in her ears. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. "Daniel, we need to get out," she whispered urgently, before he could respond. The front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, shaking the entire cabin. The sudden noise made them both jump to their feet. The wind outside had been calm, and the windows were closed. No one could have been outside, and yet, the door had slammed shut with force. Panic surged through them like electricity. They ran to the door together, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. It was as if some invisible force was holding it shut. They tried the windows, but every single one was locked from the inside. Shadows stretched across the cabin walls, elongating and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The air grew colder, biting at their skin, and every creak of the cabin made their stomachs churn with dread. Mia felt a chill run down her spine as she looked around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker, darker than natural. She could swear she saw movement, brief glimpses of something stepping out of the darkness, only to vanish the moment she blinked. Her mind was screaming that it was impossible, yet every instinct in her body told her it was real. Hours or, maybe minutes. She couldn't tell past in a haze of fear. The footsteps returned intermittently, moving from room to room, always staying just out of sight. Whispers, too, barely audible, seemed to float through the air. Words she couldn't understand, but tones that were clearly deliberate and menacing. They huddled together in the living room, clutching each other, too terrified to speak. Finally, when the first light of dawn began filtering through the dusty windows, the cabin fell silent. The footsteps stopped. The whispers stopped. Even the cold seemed to recede. Trembling, they cautiously approached the front door. This time, it opened without resistance, as if nothing had ever happened. What they saw outside didn't make sense. The forest was empty, still, peaceful, as though the previous night's events had been some terrible hallucination. But when they turned to leave, Mia's eyes caught something on the wall near the fireplace. There, smeared into the dust with fingerprints, was a message, "Never come back." The handwriting or whatever it had been was uneven, almost frantic. Some of the letters were barely legible, as though whoever or whatever had written it had been in a hurry. Mia felt bile rise in her throat. Daniel stared at it in stunned silence. They both knew, without a doubt, that the cabin had not been abandoned, not truly. Something had been inside with them, and it had left a warning. They didn't wait another moment. They grabbed their things and left the cabin, never looking back. Even now, years later, Mia can't pass a forest road without her stomach turning. Sometimes, when she's alone at night, she swears she can feel the same heavy gaze on her, the same slow, deliberate footsteps that don't belong to anyone. She tells herself it's just a memory, just fear playing tricks. But deep down, she knows better. The cabin was alive that night, and whatever it was, it had noticed them. The third and fourth stories are some of the most chilling encounters anyone has had in a cabin deep in the woods. The third story is about two friends, Liam and Ryan, who were inseparable and loved outdoor adventures. They had been hiking and camping together for years. always chasing the thrill of isolation, fresh air, and the quiet that only the forest could offer. One weekend, they decided to rent a cabin far away from civilization, a place that promised solitude and the chance to truly disconnect from the world. The cabin was small and rustic, nestled between tall pines, with snow covering the ground since it was midwinter. The approach was long and winding, a narrow trail that barely fit their car, with branches scraping against the sides and a thick blanket of silence that made the forest feel even more remote. The first night passed uneventfully. They lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, unpacked their supplies, and cooked a simple dinner of pasta and canned soup. The cabin creaked occasionally, the wind whistled through cracks in the windows, and snow slid quietly from the roof, but everything seemed perfectly normal. They even joked about ghosts and shared old scary stories, laughing at how easily the forest made their imaginations run wild. By midnight, both were asleep, the fire smoldering low, casting shadows across the room that danced along the walls. The second night, however, was a different story. Liam woke first, feeling unusually cold, despite the fire. He rubbed his arms and glanced toward the small window near the bed. That's when he heard the soft, high-pitched sound of a child laughing. It was distant at first, just a faint giggle carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. Both of them froze. A child, here. Liam and Ryan knew the cabin had never housed a family, and no children had ever been there. They exchanged uneasy glances, each unwilling to speak. "Did you hear that?" Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. Ryan nodded, eyes wide. "Yeah, that's a kid, isn't it?" Liam swallowed hard and crept toward the door, trying to peer outside. The snow outside reflected the moonlight, and the forest looked completely empty. No trees moved unnaturally, no shapes of people anywhere. And yet, when Liam opened the door fully, his heart sank. Tiny footprints had appeared in the fresh snow, leading away from the cabin. No one had been there a minute ago. The prints were small, delicate, and seemingly belonged to a child. Liam stepped back inside, feeling his stomach twist in fear. "Maybe it's, I don't know, an animal," Ryan suggested, though his voice sounded uncertain even to him. "An animal doesn't giggle like that," Liam replied sharply. "No way." They decided to sleep in the living room that night, closer together, hoping proximity to the fire and each other would make them feel safer. They set the fireplace high, double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, and tried to focus on anything other than the feeling of being watched. Hours passed, and they managed to drift into an uneasy sleep. Sometime in the early hours, Ryan woke up abruptly. He whispered Liam's name, his voice shaky. "Dude, there's someone sitting at the end of the bed." Liam blinked, groggy and half asleep. "What? There's no one here." Ryan shook his head slowly, pointing toward the shadows where the bed's foot should have been empty. "I know what I saw. I felt it too. Someone just sitting there." Liam turned on his flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing, just the empty floor and the flickering shadows from the dying fire. But then the smell hit them, a faint, cloying scent of old perfume, sweet and musky, lingering heavily in the air. It made their stomachs churn, a strange combination of nostalgia and fear. No one had been in the cabin, and yet that smell was unmistakable. They didn't speak after that, huddling together until the first light of dawn slowly crept through the window, bringing with it the relief that comes with visibility, if not safety. The fourth story is even more terrifying, and it involves a group of college friends who thought they were going for a simple weekend getaway. The cabin they rented was remote, accessed by a dirt road surrounded by thick forest, far enough that they could laugh, drink, and play games without worrying about neighbors or noise. The first night was carefree. They cooked together, joked, and sat around the fireplace, sharing stories and laughing until late. The warm glow from the fire made the cabin feel cozy, insulated from the outside world. But around midnight, Sarah woke up, her sleep disturbed by a strange sensation. At first, she thought it was a dream, but then she heard whispers, low, soft, and almost chanting, carried in from the forest outside. She froze, trying to discern whether anyone else was awake. She shook her head lightly, convinced that it must be her imagination. But the whispers grew louder, insistent, weaving in and out of the wind, repeating words she could not understand. She nudged her friend, Alex, who was sleeping nearby. "Alex, do you hear that?" Alex groaned and rolled over. "Hear what?" "It's probably just the wind, Sarah." But the wind didn't explain the sound of branches scratching against the windows, the doors slamming, or the shadows moving inside the cabin itself. The lights flickered for a moment, and for just a second, Sarah thought she saw shapes dart across the walls, avoiding the glow of the fire. Her heart raced, and she realized that no prank, no natural occurrence could explain what they were experiencing. The whispers became louder, more urgent, almost rhythmic. They didn't sound like words in any language she knew. They sounded ancient, deliberate, almost like someone or something was reciting an incantation just beyond the threshold of the cabin. Her friends woke one by one, their eyes wide with confusion and fear as they listened to the noises outside. The rest of the night was a nightmare. Branches scraped against the cabin violently, doors banged without cause, and shadows twisted in the corners, impossible to locate or identify. Every time someone tried to step outside to investigate, a cold wind pushed them back, and the whispers seemed to follow, growing louder and more mocking. None of them dared to leave until the first hints of dawn illuminated the snow-dusted forest by sunrise. The group packed their things in silence, their usual joking and chatter gone. They drove away from the cabin, making promises to themselves never to return. Years later, Sarah still hears those whispers in her dreams. They're always the same, low and deliberate, and every time they visit, she wakes up in a cold sweat, convinced that the forest never really lets go of those it calls its own. These two final stories remind anyone who ventures into the woods that isolation can be terrifying. Cabins that seem cozy and safe by day can become traps of fear by night. The forest has a way of watching, of following, and of making sure its presence is felt long after you've left. Liam, Ryan, Sarah, and her friends all left with the same lesson. Some places are not meant for humans, and sometimes curiosity can awaken something that was better left undisturbed.